Hello, Feminine Roadmappers. Welcome back to Feminine Roadmap Podcast, the podcast that helps you navigate the challenges and the changes of midlife and empowers you to live a more vibrant second half. If you find us on a podcast platform today, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share this conversation. If you're on YouTube, just look up above and ring that bell, and so you don't miss out on any more of our conversations. My guest today is going to be talking about gray divorce. She's going to be talking about the challenges and the upsides of divorce after 50 and who is seeking gray divorce and why. My guest today is Linda Hershman. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist, and she's the author of Gray Divorce, Everything You Need to Know About Later Life Breakups. Linda, thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
Gina, thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. I'd love to hear about what led you to this specific mission and message about gray divorce.
Well, it started because I wanted to go to Ireland. And just to back that up, I have always done a lot of writing, a lot of professional writing, but nothing book length. I've done magazine articles. I've done a lot of newsletter articles. I also do a lot of conference presentations, and I was writing an article on alternatives to litigated divorce when I came across the term gray divorce. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. What is it? And to start with a definition, gray divorce refers to splitting up over age 50. And it's not a term I coined. It is a term that has been in use, and in other countries they sometimes call it silver splitting or diamond divorce or different things. Anyway, when I started doing some reading about gray divorce, I began to think about my practice and how many couples come in who are over age 50 who are either divorcing or divorce questioning, couples and individuals. And I realized that it was a large percentage and that I was treating it like any other divorce. And I became curious about what I needed to know when working with couples over age 50 who were splitting up or thinking about splitting up. Now, the irony is I was well over 50 at the time, but just like we're not taught in therapist school very much about working with older individuals and couples specifically. So I got involved in learning everything I could about it, and then I answered a call for a presentation proposal for a conference that was being held in Scotland in 2019. And I thought, I wonder if gray divorce is an international situation or if it's everywhere. And then when I did some more research, I found out that it is on the rise in every country where divorce is legal. And I thought, great, if I present in Scotland, I can get to Ireland and parlay a 3-day conference into a 15-day road trip. Meanwhile, after the conference, I got a call from a publisher saying, we were at the conference, we heard you speak. Have you thought about writing a book? And I said, I've never thought about it, but if you're calling me, I guess I'd better. And I ended up not accepting the contract they offered me for various reasons and deciding to self-publish the book. But I still had to, they didn't just say, here's your contract. I had to write a proposal, and part of a book proposal is to research the competition. When I started looking into what was out there, there were some things that were very obvious to me. There were a couple, there was a lot out there on gray divorce, but they fell into several niche categories. One category was books written by accountants and financial planners and attorneys and dealing with their subject. One category was stories of people who were surviving and thriving after great divorce. And then there was another category that I nicknamed The Girlfriend's Guide to Great Divorce. And they were books written by women whose husbands typically left them for younger women. And the tone of the book was, hey, girlfriend, I'm going to show you how to make him regret he ever left you. And what I realized was there was nothing comprehensive. There was nothing systemically oriented that took into consideration the entire family system, the entire cultural system, and there was nothing culturally competent. And there was my book.
It's a lot to take in, and I'm sure that it makes a difference in the country that you're in some ways, right? Because you mentioned culture, you have family culture, you have the country you live in culture, you might have, a national culture as well. And so I'm interested to find out, did you see it as a universal issue when you went to Europe?
Well, as I said, I had done my research beforehand because when I went to submit a proposal, it was an international conference. And so I wanted to submit on a topic that had international appeal. And yes, it's, like I said, it's in every country in the world where divorce is legal.
That's right.
And
that's right.
by the way, I just came back from Spain where I presented. And I've been invited to present in Japan next year.
Wow. So what did you learn about gray divorce? What are we seeing as the trend that's precipitating this particular divorce pattern?
Okay, a couple of fun facts here. 1 out of every 4 couples over age 50 is going to divorce, 1 of every 4 married couples. So 25% of married couples over age 50 are going to get a divorce. This is up from 1 in 10 in 1990. And it is the only demographic where the divorce trend has been rising. In every other demographic, it's either stayed level or has fallen. And the other fun fact, which I think is going to surprise a lot of people, is 66% of gray divorces are initiated by women.
Interesting. And why do you think that is?
Well, there are several reasons. The probably biggest reason is because we can. Until fairly recently, women did not have the economic or legal powers to be able to really take care of ourselves. Typically, women, maybe not so much in the 50s, but in the 60s and up, did not have careers that were self-sustaining, or they put them aside while they were raising the children. And so when they're ready to come back, they're coming back at a big disadvantage. And also, it's really shocking to think about it, but until I think 1976, women could not get a credit card in their own names. They could not get a mortgage without having a man sign for it. And so those roadblocks are out of the way for, I'm not going to say all women by any means, but for many women. So that's one factor. Another factor is we live much longer. It used to be that in our grandparents' age group, if you were lucky enough to live until retirement, you would retire at age 60, you would get your watch, and if you were lucky, you had another few years to enjoy your life. Now people live much longer, and so people who are retiring at 65 or even 70 might have another 20, 25 good, healthy, active years. And oftentimes people grow differently, and they might look at their partner and think, do I really want to spend another 20, 30 years with this person? And then no-fault divorce is a big reason why the rate has gone up as well. It used to be that if you wanted a divorce, you needed grounds. And there were 7 grounds that were acceptable. I can't name all 7, but they were things like adultery, addiction, abuse, the marriage not being consummated, incarceration, and I forget the other 2, but I'm really excited. I remembered 5. And
Congratulations, Linda. I'm impressed.
thank you. And now no-fault divorce is legal in all 50 states, and it's actually required in some states in the country. When we had fault divorce, it set up situations where one person had to be the bad guy and one person had to be the good guy. And so even if they were good, compatible, transactional marriages that just ran their course, if you wanted to get a divorce, you had to go into court and you had to say, my husband did this to me, or my wife did this to me. Now, think about what that would be like for children, even adult children, to hear their parents having to go into a court of law and manufacture grounds for the divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 4th reason for the rise is the general acceptance in society. I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, I could probably count the number of kids I knew whose parents were divorced. And
it's interesting. What I would like to take the question from what would it take, or what could it take to save or to resuscitate some of these marriages? Or is that something that people just aren't open to?
Yeah, very often people are open to it. Unfortunately, as a licensed marriage and family therapist for almost 30 years now, one thing I learned very early on is that most people come into my office for couple counseling years after they should have. And of course, the longer you wait, the more things build up, the more problems happen. But yeah, first of all, even for people who have the means and who have the ability and have the support, divorce is not fun.
Yeah.
It's not something anybody aspires to. And so oftentimes couples will attempt to see if the marriage can be repaired before they decide to go for divorce. And best case, if they do decide to divorce, they can at least learn something about themselves and what they brought into the relationship, so that hopefully they don't have to repeat it. But there is also a protocol that I am certified in called discernment counseling. And it's designed specifically for couples who can't decide whether to stay together, whether to go to marriage counseling, or whether to move towards separation and divorce. And it's a brief protocol. It's generally 1 to 5 sessions, and it's all about making a decision. And once the couple has made the decision, and there are 3 paths. One is stay the course, do nothing right now, and revisit at a later time. Another is move towards separation and divorce. And then the 3rd path is to commit to marriage counseling to see if the marriage can be revived. And then once a decision is made, I can refer the couple to the appropriate resources depending on which path they've chosen. And so discernment counseling is a wonderful tool for those couples who think they want a divorce, they're leaning toward divorce, but there's this little doubt.
Mm. It's interesting to me because, as a coach, I help people initiate change in their life. I help them to identify what it is they want to change, and then I help them strategize how to change. So it's interesting to me. I feel like there's a bit of the element of when someone changes, right? How that impacts our relationships with other people. And I'm wondering in my mind, and trying to figure out how to process it outwardly, but I'm wondering if you can identify some, I guess, markers to what led to this. I'm sure not every marriage falls under, like you said earlier, niches of the situation. But I'm wondering if you have two people going through life together, do you often see that maybe one has really begun to they've really changed a lot, or they've gone through a growth journey and maybe the other partner hasn't gone on a growth journey, and that could be one of the indicators of what's putting their marriage into maybe a rocky path? Or are there other kinds of indicators that you've identified as you talk to people that maybe someone who is still married could watch out for?
One of the things that is so fascinating about my job is no matter how many years I've been doing this and how many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of couples I've worked with, every time I think I've seen it all, the next thing walks in.
Yeah, so there are I'm sure there's a lot of variables, but I wondered if there were patterns.
Oh, it's hard to pin down. There are so many patterns. Like I said, a lot of it is just people growing differently, or to your point, one growing and the other one not at all. And keep in mind the dynamics. Again, we're talking about couples who a large percentage, the women have stayed home with the kids and haven't had a chance to develop their careers, their skills, their hobbies, their friendships, their outside interests. And they may be looking around and saying, okay, the kids don't need me anymore on a day-to-day basis. I don't have a lot of responsibilities in this realm, and it's time for me. And the husbands very often have a lot of difficulty adjusting to that.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking, I saw an Instagram short video, and the guy was talking about women and how who takes care of the woman. The idea was, the woman is there nurturing the family, preparing the food, cleaning the house, meeting needs. And his question was, well, who's taking care of her? And I think there is an element of being in a situation where there's an expectation that some women feel, whether it's real or not, I can't say, but an expectation of staying in that role of being at other people's disposal. And I think a lot of women feel at midlife, at least from the women that I've interviewed in these 6 years that I've been podcasting, almost 6 years now, there's this real feeling of, like you mentioned, who am I and where do I fit now? And I think that's a huge part, isn't it?
Yes, it's absolutely a huge part. And there are so many other factors. It could be that one partner gets sick and the other one is not a good caretaker for them and can't handle the responsibility. It could be one of the most interesting things I found when I was doing my research for the book is in Japan, they have a name for gray divorce, and it's called wet leaves under feet syndrome.
Huh.
It refers to, in the Japanese culture, the men spend their lives being totally career focused. They're not very engaged with the family. They're not very engaged in activities or friendships or anything like that. They retire and they don't know what to do with themselves, and they become like wet leaves under their wives' feet.
Ah, yes, I understand it. Okay.
And there is actually a diagnosis in Japan for women whose, it's called retired husband syndrome. And women develop clinical symptoms. They develop depression, they develop anxiety, they develop somatic symptoms because their husbands are just there all the time.
It is interesting. We have a rhythm to our life, right? And we do shift as women often for other people. I'm not saying it's a bad or a good thing. I just think that in my mind, I'm picturing if your husband's home all the time, all of a sudden, and your pattern has been when he's home, I do X, Y, and Z. And then he goes to work and I do all of these other things. And now he's home all the time. It might feel like that entire piece of your life has no place to fit anymore. Like your own time, your own woman space, I suppose, is now,
Yes.
for lack of a better term, invaded, right? Because you've lost it. I wonder if that's the emotional state that a lot of women feel. And I think it's interesting that there's actually clinical behaviors or things you can diagnose, that there's symptoms. I think that's really fascinating. I hadn't thought about it like that.
Yeah, I found it absolutely fascinating.
So when you came across this opportunity to write this book and talk about this topic, what did you find the most surprising about late in life breakups?
Well, the most surprising thing I found was that women initiated them
Mm-hmm.
for the most.
And what was the reasoning for that, do you think? Just
Well,
because, like you said, the empowerment that we've gained since the
right,
70s?
empowerment we've gained and the societal acceptance. Yeah,
Interesting.
absolutely. And another thing I found that was surprising at first, but when I thought about it again as a family therapist, it made perfect sense to me, is that we have this belief that adult children of divorce, ACODS is the acronym, that because they're adults, if their parents split up, they can just absorb the losses and go on. Well, they're adults, they understand. And in many ways, adult children are much more impacted than their younger counterparts whose parents are getting divorced. And another fun fact, the worst time for families to divorce is when the kids first go off to college.
And that's often, right, when marriages, they make the decision.
Right, right. Because the thinking is, well, they're going off to college, they're
Out of the house.
now, they're out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
It won't impact. We can leave now. We can split up now. And it's the worst time for parents to get divorced.
Do they find that these students struggle in school or drop out, or what is it that is making it so hard for them?
Okay. When you think about the time when you're leaving for college, especially if you're going away to school, it is your time to start to individuate, to figure out who you are separate from your family, and to develop your own hobbies, interests. For some people, it's a chance to make friends that they didn't grow up with, or who are very different from they. And when you find out that your parents are divorcing, you have one foot here and one foot here. You can't really move on with your life because part of you is back worrying about, are my parents okay? What's happening at home? How are my younger siblings, if you have them? Where am I going to stay when I come home for spring break? What is my home now?
Mm.
Mm. So
Instability, basically.
yeah, they never
Mm-hmm.
get to really transition into that college experience.
So now, what do you encourage people? Because the book is everything you need to know about later life breakups. What is it that people need to know?
Well, first, they, I think, need to understand why this is happening, and also to look at what the benefits are for people, and also what the fears and the real concerns are for people who are divorcing in later life, and to understand the impact on adult children of divorce, to understand the special challenges for those listening who are part of a POC or an LGBT community, what your special concerns or issues are, what the alternatives are to litigated divorce, what you can do if you're not sure whether or not you want to get divorced, and also to understand what kind of supports are available to you.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, I think in any relationship, we have variances in personality, we have changes, nothing stays in a place of stasis. I think marriage is unique because we have expectations on marriage that we don't really have on any other relationships, of ourselves, our roles within that relationship. And I think that also, and I'm wondering if this is something you come up against, who we are in our 20s when most people are choosing their partner is very different from who we are at 40, 50, 60 years old. Do you find that it's often because, it's like they're different. We're miles and miles and galaxies away from who we were when we came together as a couple versus who we are now?
Hopefully, who we are in our 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s is not the same as who we are in our 20s. If somebody said to me when I was in my mid 20s, this is who you're going to be and what your life is going to look like in my mid 60s, I would have said, you talking to me? And
yeah, please don't let that be the case, right? No, I'm just saying it's an interesting thought,
right,
that when we choose a mate, we're typically young and we have not experienced a lot. We're working off of ideas, not necessarily experiences when we make our choices.
right. And one thing I find it in all age groups, but especially clients I work with in their 20s and 30s, is they make the mistake of looking at the potential rather than the reality.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the potential could be true, but it isn't yet a reality, right? It's an idea. Like I said, in our 20s, we work off of ideas, not experience, because we haven't had enough.
And as I was joking with you before we started, and we were talking about the technical issues, as an Army major once said to me, hope is not a plan.
Mm.
And so, on the one hand, most of us are not the same people, but alternatively, there are people who don't grow and change.
Yeah.
As we were talking about, as their partners are growing and changing, they're having to make a decision about, do I leave them in the dust because nothing is changing here?
Mm-hmm. And I feel like one of the realities in relationships are we can barely control ourselves, but if we could control something, it would just be us, not somebody else. Do you know what I mean? And I think, it's a very, from the outside of this conversation, I'm have not experienced gray divorce. And most of my friends happen to still be married. The ones who didn't make it, that was an early like a realization early on that it wasn't a good match or whatever. But I find it interesting because my perspective on it is that, marriage is a different relationship than a lot of other relationships. And there's a lot of factors that come into it, and it is difficult when two people are on different paths, different growth journeys, different. As we age, I suppose we have different ideas of what retirement looks like or what life should feel like. And you have to navigate so many different levels of your life and how you feel about things with someone else who may not see and feel the same way that you do moving into this new season. I feel like each season brings new conversation points. And do you find that people are not talking about these things? They're just kind of compartmentalizing them in their head and it's causing a divide? And their first time they're talking about it is with you?
Sometimes, again, keep in mind that people usually come into my office because there was a crisis. They don't come in when they start to experience problems. And again, it's usually, not always, but usually the woman who is experiencing the problem first.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time there's a crisis and everything blows up, unfortunately, oftentimes the woman is just checked out. And once we check out, it's hard for us to get back.
Sure.
However, so people come in because there's a crisis, and crisis equals danger plus opportunity. And so a crisis can be an opportunity to shift into a different kind of relationship. So on the one hand, there hasn't been this conversation. The other side, this is what I wanted to get to, is John and Julie Gottman, who are considered the foremost researchers in the marriage counseling world today. They have done longitudinal studies with, I don't know how many, hundreds or thousands of couples. They say that every relationship has at least one irreconcilable problem. And I can speak to my own marriage. We have an irreconcilable problem. And sometimes there's more than one. Now, the irreconcilable problems don't have to end the marriage. It really is a function of how you choose to talk about the problem. And whether you can hear each other, respect each other's point of view, validate each other, or in some cases, make a conscious decision. This is the thing we are just not going to talk about. And oftentimes people are okay about that. And so sometimes people come in because they've been talking and fighting over and over for years about this irreconcilable difference. And so the first thing they have to understand is you're not going to fix it. Let's look at other alternatives.
What would a couple of examples of that look like when you say every marriage has an irreconcilable difference? Would it be something as simple as I want to live in the city and that person wants to live in the country, or, I want to retire to Barbados and they want to retire to Pomona, or like what are these irreconcilable differences? What do they look like?
Well, those certainly could be irreconcilable differences, although with those kinds of differences, at some point you kind of do have to make a decision. But the biggest irreconcilable difference that is in front of us every minute of every day now is politics. Yeah.
Differences in ideology or values and whatnot. That's interesting because we tend to choose people that are like us in our 20s, or at least in our minds, they're like us, our 20s and 30s. But I think that's the challenge of any relationship, to be completely honest, Linda. And I've thought about this a lot because I have adult children, and they have, say, friendships that they've had for years, and they go through these kind of seismic changes sometimes, and it's like outside of their control. And I feel like we have choices to make in relationship. We get to choose. Do I want to stay in this relationship? How much do I want to give to this relationship? Is this, I think this is not maybe the right word, but is this worth it? Meaning, what's the value gained and given in this relationship in this season of life? And I think it's so much easier to do with relationships that don't have a bind or a tie like marriage. And I feel like that complicates it, because we do feel there, like you said, divorce is a difficult thing to go through. I have friends whose parents divorced when they were young, and they talk to me about it sometimes in the context of a conversation, and it still has an impact. To your point, one of my friends was 20 or 21, one was 14, but I think you're right. The 14-year-old, if you will, did better than the 20 or 21-year-old in terms of how they felt about it. It's almost like a betrayal. The longer the parents wait, it feels like the children felt more betrayed, or else they weren't surprised at all, But I find relationships are complicated, whether we're married or not. But I think marriage has so many more expectations and ideas around it. I'm a very conservative person, so I have very specific, ideas and expectations around marriage. And my heart is for marriage. My heart is for marriages to work, but I understand that that's unrealistic, that they will all work. Right? I know this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when I am working with couples, my client is the relationship. And so if they're coming in and saying, we want this to be a better relationship, or we're not sure, but we want to see if it can be a better relationship, I'm behind that. And that is what I will help them work toward, unless and until they say, this is not going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I understand your role. I just find the conversation interesting, and that's why I invited you onto the show, because like I said, my heart would be to figure out how to help these people. But again, not everybody wants that help. And so,
right. Also, the therapist, that, to your point, is not my job. My job is to look at the patterns that people are bringing into their relationships that are creating an unhealthy dynamic, because relationships function in patterns. Each person brings their own stuff into it, and each person is responsible for changing the way they are relating in the relationship. And so that's a good part of my job, to see the patterns and help them work on changing them in vivo. Now, if I'm doing discernment counseling, that's a very different thing. That is, in a sense, more like coaching. But again, I'm coming in as a neutral.
Right.
Their path. And it's my job to help them figure out, to ask them the questions that either they have not asked themselves, or ask it in ways they might not have thought of. But again, to ask them to look at, what are you bringing into this that has gotten your marriage to the point where divorce is on the table?
Yes. And that is I honor your journey, because it is difficult, because sometimes from the outside it's much easier to see things, but we also don't have a clear glass, because we're not in the situation, having had that buildup of experiences and emotions that the couple has had. Now, if you had to share 3 kind of anchor points, 3 things that you want people to consider, questions they can ask themselves, what 3 things, Linda, would you like to share?
Well, the number one thing, and this is not specific to gray divorce, actually most of these probably aren't, but is you should always love your children more than you hate your spouse.
Mm.
That is my number one rule. And number two is, if you are divorcing or divorce questioning, get support. Your friends are great, but your friends are not objective. They're on your side. And while it's nice to get the validation of, yeah, I always knew they were a jerk, that's not helpful support when you're going through this or you're deciding. And especially if you're trying to decide, if you ask 10 friends, you're going to get 11 different opinions probably.
Yes.
So get support. I certainly am in favor of support with a therapist. There are many other ways to get support, though, and I do talk about them in the book. The third takeaway is, if you have any doubt whatsoever, even if it's only 1%, consider discernment counseling or working with a therapist before you make that decision.
Okay. Thank you for that. And Linda, how can people find you and get in contact with you?
The best way is through my author website, which is Linda Hershman, HERSHMAN.com. And it has information there. The ebook is available on Amazon. So if you want any book, you can just go right on there. The paperback book is available through BookBaby, and the information for that is on the site. And also, I am always running promos for podcast listeners. And so if you're listening to this now and you want to buy the paperback version, send me a message, send me an email, and I'll give you a promo code that you can get it at a discount.
What's that email address, Linda?
Linda, well, my website will give you
contact you there.
Yeah, go to my website, lindahershman.com.
Perfect. Well, Linda, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this research and to write this book and to step into the realm of helping marriages, that are in trouble. We need people like you that are willing to do the work to help people figure these things out, because it is difficult. And it is it's a huge life event, isn't it?
It is a huge life event. And even, I don't want to say more so, differently so, when you are older and you're thinking about things like, who is going to take care of me?
Yeah. Friends, today, if you're interested in getting the information that Linda shared, please head on over to www.feminineroadmap.com/episode 324. And if you are on YouTube, just look down below. Everything is right there for you. You just click right through to Linda. And, this is one of those conversations that I chose to have because I know it's happening in people's lives. And midlife has so many challenges and changes, and this is one of them. And if you find yourself questioning where you're at in your marriage, what you want to do in your marriage, I do encourage you to find the support that you need outside of your friends and family, to someone who can give you a more objective perspective, to help you think through the processes and the questions that you have. And of course, Linda is here. Her book is here to help you. So please take the time to do the research and get the support that you need before you make a major life decision like this. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that this conversation has been beneficial to you. If you know someone that is going through this, please share this conversation with them. Please share this resource with them and help them set their feet on a path to a resolution. Thank you so much for joining us today, my friends. I look forward to sharing more interesting people, conversations, and strategies with you in the weeks to come. Take care, my friends. Bye-bye.